In this video, we're going to start our introduction to the second half of chapter 3, where we'll go into the various different types of tissues that make up the body. So we'll go through epithelial tissue in this video, and then in subsequent videos, we'll talk about connective tissue, muscles, and the nervous tissue. The learning objectives for this first part are to name the chief tissue type and its subtypes, and explain how they differ structurally and functionally. Also, we want to be able to compare the locations for each tissue, especially each tissue subtype. And we'll end this chapter by talking about the process of tissue repair, so inflammation versus an immune reaction, fibrosis versus regeneration. Things you want to pay attention to for each tissue type. Importantly, you want to pay attention to the function. So what does this tissue type, what does tissue subtype do? Then you want to pay attention to the characteristics. What differentiates this tissue from other tissues? And also, you want to look at the different classifications and subtypes. How are we grouping things within the larger tissue type? We'll start with epithelial tissue, which is the lining. So these are the linings, the coverings, the tissue that makes glands. And they function in things like protection, absorption, and filtration. A classic example of epithelial tissue is the epithelial of your skin, which protects you against bacterial infection, for example. All epithelial tissue has a continuous sheet except for glands. So these cells fit together tightly. They're bound by desmosomes and tight junctions. They have a free surface, which is open to either the outside or into the cavity, which we call the apical side. And then the bottom rests on a basement membrane. This is an avascular tissue, meaning it does not have a blood supply, and it also easily regenerates. That's why losing a little bit of skin cells or cutting your skin isn't that big of a deal, because the epithelial tissue can grow back. We classify epithelial tissue in two ways. First, how many layers are there? One layer, we call that a simple tissue. More than one layer, we say it's stratified. After we classify it by layer, we then classify it by shape. So squamous cells are flat, like fish scales, cuboidal are cubes, and columnar are column-shaped. So this is what that looks like. Again, for our simple tissue, we've got the apical surface and then the basal surface. Stratified, more than one layer, still has an apical side and a basal side. And this is showing you those cells. Again, squamous cells are flat, cuboidal cells are cubes, and columnar cells are columns. So overall, we want to put them together. So we can have a simple squamous epithelial tissue, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, more than one stratified squamous. In humans, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar are pretty rare, so we're not going to talk about those. We will mention a different tissue type, which is our transitional type. It's technically stratified, and it functions a little bit different than the other tissues. So starting at the most simple here, our simple squamous cells, so one layer of thin, flat cells. And you want to think about how the shape of those cells allow them to do their job. So because it's one thin layer of thin cells, things can move through those cells quickly. And so we see this tissue in places where we need diffusion and filtration to happen fast, like in our lungs, for example, in the alveoli of our lungs. These are serous membranes. They're found in capillary walls as well, so places where you need that diffusion to move quickly. Now, when the cells get a little bit bigger, this is where they have more space, they have more volume to do more complicated functions. In our squamous cells, these cells are super thin, so they can't make a lot of stuff, but in the cubes and the columns, they have more volume, and so they can make more proteins, for example, or pigments that need to be secreted or absorbed. So you're going to see simple cuboidal, for example, in a lot of glands and their ducts because they're secreting things that are going to be released through that gland or duct system. These are also found in the kidney tubule walls because they need to absorb lots of things, the surface of our ovaries because of their role in hormone production as well. Simple columnar is in a similar boat to the cuboidal. So again, they've got a large volume that allows them to do a lot of things, to make a lot of stuff. So these line our digestive tract. A classic example here is the goblet cells in our digestive tract that secrete mucus to keep the tract moist. A special kind of cell is the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. It's a mouthful, but they actually are pretty cool cells. So these are cells that are simple. They are one layer, but we call them pseudostratified because the nuclei are not in a row. So if you look at it quickly under a microscope, you'll see nuclei all staggered and you'll think, oh, there must be multiple layers of cells here. But actually, it's just one layer with non-aligned nuclei. These cells are important because they have little cilia, little baby hairs on the apical surface, and those hairs help move particles. So they line our respiratory tract to help move mucus and particles through our tract. They're in our ear, they're in some female reproductive organs to move eggs through. So the cilia are involved with movement. Now let's talk about stratified. So again, simple is one layer, stratified, more than one layer. The most common stratified tissue type is the stratified squamous cells, and these are found at friction sites. So sites where you need the ability to rub and then lose a few cells and not have it be a big deal, that's where you're going to see this tissue. And the reason these are squamous cells as opposed to a cube or a column is because the cells are so small, they're so skinny, it's very easy for the body to replace them. They're cheap to make. And so we're going to put lots of layers of these cheap, easy to make cells in areas where we're going to lose a lot of cells to friction. So the outer layer of our skin, the lining of our mouth and esophagus, these are our friction sites. And so that's why we're going to have these sort of quick, easy, disposable cells. Again, apical surface, basement membrane, and this is the most common stratified tissue type. Last, we have the transitional epithelial tissue, and this is a really interesting tissue type because what it does is it changes its shape. The cells are built to stretch, and so you find these in our urinary system, specifically around our bladder. And when the bladder is relaxed, these are going to be rounded cells. They're going to be more cuboidal. And then as the bladder fills with urine, they're going to stretch and become that squamous cell shape to make room for all of that urine. And so we call them transitional because they change their shape. Okay, so for this end of video, you want to try and think to yourself, what does epithelial tissue have in common? How can we differentiate the different subtypes? Where can we find them? What do they do? In the next video, we'll cover connective tissue as well as moving through the other major tissues.